CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Arts, culture and heritage as levers for building Africa is the main theme at the ongoing 34th African Union Summit being held virtually this year. Now, the theme captures the African Union's aspirations of having art, culture and heritage play a key role in promoting Pan-African consciousness, socio-economic development and integration as described in the continent's Master Plan, Agenda 2063. However, societies across the world are rapidly globalizing, making the goal of a unified African cultural identity a bit extra difficult. Meanwhile, various forms of African cultural expression are yet to be mainstream despite the massive socio-economic potential seen in other parts of the world. So what plans does the African Union have to make the theme a success? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, let's bring in our guests to help us explore this subject. And joining us via Zoom from Harare, Zimbabwe, is Farai Mfunya. He's the Executive Director of the Culture Fund of Zimbabwe Trust, a non-profit organization that connects African communities in the arts to financial and technical resources. Ukona Nsali Mlandu joins us from Cape Town in South Africa. She's an independent arts manager, curator and arts facilitator. And from Washington, D.C., Patrick Kabanda, the author of the book, The Creative Wealth of Nations, Can the Arts Advance Development? Well, thank you all for joining us in this discussion today. So I want to start off with the theme of this year's African Union Summit, which is drawn from Aspiration 5 of the African Union Agenda 2063 on African cultural identity. Now, to have a theme such as culture suggests that probably there are issues of concern. Let's start off with you, Patrick, because you are an African based in the United States. Are we simply being sentimental, or is there an importance for the discussion of this topic of cultural identity today?
Yes, thank you so much for having us here. Yes, I think culture is one of our greatest assets we have in Africa, and unfortunately, it's often neglected in our development and social basically agenda. And I think it's high time we take this seriously, and partly because this year the United Nations has declared it as the year of the international creative economy for sustainable development. So I think that it's very important we take culture seriously, and partly because Africa's image is still really bad. And I think culture and the arts can help us project a much better positive African image.
Changing Africa's identity, Ukona, is this achievable though?
I think it's not so much about changing Africa's image than it is about providing platforms for what already exists to be showcased and amplified, right? Because if you see, even in the biggest popular culture, kind of cultural products that have emerged recently, it's very clear that the world does reference Africa and look at Africa for inspiration when they're trying to kind of create alternative ways of being, as opposed to the more imperialistic cultures, the dominant cultures that have been perceived as the standard. And I think for me, another point is that if we understand the soft power of cultural diplomacy, we begin to understand why it is in Africa's best interest to invest in making sure that what we have to offer is given the platform, and we kind of are more intentional and deliberate about what it is that we put out there about ourselves, that we control the narrative that goes out there, and we kind of leverage what we already have. So this drive is not to kind of present a picture of something that doesn't already exist. It's there. It's just that to a large extent, people were speaking about Africa from their own narrow perspectives, as Patrick has said. But now what we're calling for is for Africans to drive the counter narrative to the already existing problematic narratives that are out there about the continent.
Farai, what are your thoughts?
Well, thanks for having me, first of all. But I do agree with Ukona and Patrick in the fact that we now need to be more assertive, and perhaps the younger generations of Africans need to be more aggressive in claiming our place on the planet, in the world, and just come out and show everyone that we are what we are. We are not creating anything new. We are just awakening within ourselves and telling the story ourselves and driving the narrative ourselves. There's no doubt about it that Africa has offered the world a lot, especially African culture, the African way of living. If you look at global cultures, global art forms, for example, that have been very successful commercially, rock and roll, jazz, blues in America, maybe the sounds of South America, which borrowed a lot from the sounds of West Africa, the drum beats of Africa, the historical affinities and experiences of the slaves that are carried through the music. And Africa has that to offer and has a right alongside other cultures that claim they're important on this planet. And so Africans don't necessarily have to, say, do we have the right to be on this planet? Our cultures are our way of life, and we just now need to be articulating that better and creating the narratives ourselves and driving the narratives. So yes, there are identities that we ourselves need to look at differently and tell the world that this is who we are. And we have so many ways of asserting those identities. The world will be poorer without African culture. There's no doubt about it in my mind.
So you bring in an interesting point, Farai, that of the role of the young people on the continent, because Africa has the youngest population in the world. But you find that, this same young population is the one that has seemingly adopted a much more borderless scenario as a result of the emerging technology and growing up in technology. How relevant is cultural preservation, though, for young people?
I also believe very strongly that as Africans, we mustn't be afraid for our cultures to intersect with other cultures. I don't think Africans should fear that if we are exposed to other cultures, our own cultures are going to disappear, are going to be subsumed by, perhaps other more commercially marketed cultures. I come from a country where, over a century of colonialism and westernization, there are art forms that have gone through wars and isolation and still survive and are resilient. They have interfaced with so many other foreign cultures. But what I'm seeing now is a lot of young Zimbabweans, for example, starting to, in music, for example, sing songs in local languages. They are going back to reclaiming some of their totems from their clans, and they are now putting in some of the motifs of African cultures into their fabric for fashion, and they are wanting now to find where African foods are, and they're doing it in their own ways. And they are globally connected, globally sensitive, globally aware, but they realize that there is something of the essence in them that is African, something that has to do with the soulfulness, with an African spirit that everyone who visits the continent, no matter where they go, west, south, east, north, will always say to you, oh, I sense a kind of humanity. And what is that sense of humanity that all these people feel? It's not just the sun and the warmth, it's the culture, right? So globalization is going to manifest itself better if it actually allows us to see the broader diversity of the world cultures. The dominant global medias have often given us limited spaces for participation and limited spaces to appreciate what is actually out there. Now, is it the fault of the globally dominating media networks of the world to do that? No, because it's about country and corporate interests. What Africans need to do is to populate some of those spaces. We know 5% of the internet has got African content on it.
Right.
The dominant global media networks have got very little in terms of African culture. Now, the 34th summit of the AU must address these things. They must allow infrastructure that allows greater mobility within African countries and across African regions, across the continent, so that African cultural and artistic producers are able to freely travel within their own countries and within their own region and within the African continent.
Right.
Once they do that, they are likely to do that into the rest of the world. So I wouldn't be worried too much about African culture, facing a major challenge against global cultures. African cultures will evolve, obviously. Younger people will be more contemporary, both materially and spiritually. And African cultures have always adapted. African culture is not what it was 100 years, 500 years ago. And so African cultures are very capable of incorporating technology into their culture. They're very capable of borrowing nice, interesting, exciting things from other cultures and getting rid of things that do not work for them. So globalization is okay, but I think African cultures are so anchored in history and in their spirituality that they will last and they will ride the wave of globalization.
Ukona, you're in the performing arts. Let's get your practical view here, because you've been dealing with the performing arts industry in South Africa for quite a while now. Do you see Africa's arts and culture, as Farai has explained, appreciated on the continent and beyond?
No, absolutely. So I've worked in the performance arts field for about 16 years, and now lately I'm in the visual arts world, right? And basically, if you quantify, and I don't have the stats with me right now, the amount of, because there's this issue of like artists going over to other countries to present works or exporting artworks. And that mobility that exists in that space where there are festivals, there are art fairs, it sits, I want to believe that it somehow sits outside of what the government ends up quantifying when they're trying to understand this issue of whether the African art is kind of being appreciated outside. But there's a movement out there of creative people who are exchanging ideas, who are creating, because even as one becomes globalized, they still create, their main creative influence and inspiration will always be influenced by their identity, right? And so as these expressions take on whatever form they take on, intrinsically, they still maintain the person who is the conduit to this artistic work. So, I mean, there are entire circuits of festivals that exist, that see this exchange happening on the continent as well as internationally. And lately, they've even taken on a more kind of innovative approach where they're happening online. You know, just before this interview, I was part of one such platform where people from across the continent were exchanging and doing performances and planning. So it completely does exist, the movement and the collaborations and the interest in each other's cultures.
Let's hear from Patrick, though, in terms of what Ukona is talking about, the amount of art and culture that we see today emanating from Africa. Because, Patrick, you've written a book on the creative wealth of nations. Can't the arts advance development? First of all, what inspired you to write about this? And can the arts actually advance development?
Yes, I think Ukona and Farai, the points they've made are quite all very relevant. And we need to listen to such people quite often. The arts can indeed advance development. Now, why I wrote the book is a personal story. I grew up being told, oh, don't become a musician. You're going to starve to death. You're not going to go anywhere. Go become an accountant, a doctor, or lawyer, and professions like that. And many, many young people I meet in Africa are being told things like this. In my case, I grew up in quite really terrible poverty, but actually, as I say in the book's prelude, I also grew up in wealth, and the wealth was culture. I was surrounded by even bad music in Africa. We have some of the most diverse bands, and that was kind of music I didn't even know that existed. And of course, with the Western influence of organ music, all that was me. Then we have the drums, which are made back home in Uganda. And all these things were really quite enriching. And that's actually was my entry. So I believe that my own personal story shows that indeed we can overcome a lot of things. And for me, music wasn't just like, oh, I am playing music to make money, but also I made friends. Uganda was going through a lot of difficult times, as many other countries do, and maybe still do, but music was a place to go and find refuge. So I think, and that's what really brings the human spirit alive, and that's what keeps us going. So I think the arts have a profound way they can influence us. And as I say also in the book, I struggled with math and still struggle. The only way I understand math is actually through music, because there's a lot of mathematical elements in music. But one thing I should point out, advancement is also education. I think as the great Nelson Mandela from South Africa said, education, I think, is the best weapon to basically move ahead. And I think that in education, one of the things we are missing is the arts and culture. They are promoting so much science and technology and engineering and all that, and they always cut music and other forms of the arts because they think they will never take our kids anywhere. And we are really shortchanging ourselves with all the diverse wealth we have in Africa. If we put back the arts in our curricula, we are going to see a lot of progress because that's to do with expanding the mind, okay? And you can tell me all you want about Zimbabwe and about South Africa. If you don't tell me about their culture, I'm very unlikely to understand that country very well. And I think when we do add the arts, we are not only going to get to understand each other, but also broadening our minds to think more creatively. And I think that's one way the arts can indeed provide a lot of advancement.
All right, we'll leave it there for the moment, but we're going to take a short break. When we return, we'll come back with more analysis on the potential of arts, culture, and heritage in powering Africa's development. Do stay with us.
Life moves pretty fast. Ideas move at the speed of sound. Technology moves at the speed of light. If you don't filter out the noise, you might miss the details. We pay attention to the details because they matter, showing you a different perspective. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Farai Mfunya in Harare, Ukona and Sali Mlandu in Cape Town, and Patrick Abanda in Washington are still our guests today. Let's continue with this discussion with you, Ukona, because we've heard about how the world culture has dominated the globe as a result of the narrative. But we also hear that thousands of artifacts looted from African towns over a century ago still lie in European and British museums, for instance, and institutions, coupled with what we are seeing as disappearing languages and the homogenizing of the languages of the West. What do you see as the impact that this has had on our society?
I mean, obviously, it's meant that the playing field in terms of our starting point as a continent with regards to claiming our own slice of the cake is not level. And therefore, there is a need for this to be recognized and for effort to be made to have those difficult conversations about the returning of artifacts, about the kind of programming that exists and how it needs to not favor or privilege. I can't get to the word, but be mindful that the process of redressing and correcting these historic wrongs that have impacted the way that African culture is perceived, what platforms it's able to penetrate, etc. It needs to be intentional, and we need to have the difficult conversations around it. And we also need to move from a premise that says we understand culture to be dynamic. It's not cast in stone, and by investing in our culture in this way, we are creating an environment for our self-actualization as Africans, that where we dictate the terms as opposed to the other way around.
So let's have that difficult conversation, though. Patrick, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, yes. So you probably are aware of the article a colleague of mine at the World Bank and I wrote about returning African art home, which appeared in The Guardian a few years ago. And what we came up with, and actually a friend, colleague, the one who suggested this directly, that we should come up with something called the foreign culture investment, in that the discussions like, oh, don't return back the art to Africa because it's a mess. Going back to some of our points I made earlier, we should leave this art somewhere where it can be safe, because there's a lot of fighting. And if this art is taken back, it will be destroyed. Well, there are two problems with that premise. The first one is that not all Africa is fighting. The second one is Africa is not a country. So what we are suggesting within that kind of discussion, okay, let's say there's some museum in Europe or here, and by the way, some of these pieces are in basements gathering dust, not really being shown to people. So why don't we say, okay, with all this money they give to Kenya or they give to Zimbabwe or Uganda, whatever it is, why don't we create some kind of cultural investments where you can even have rotating museums? Now, I'm happy to say that I think the president of France, Macron, I think has had discussions to return some pieces which were looted from West Africa back.
Right.
Recently, I saw a piece about Egypt getting back some pieces. And I think some time ago, Italy also got some pieces back. I think this is very, very important. And one of the things we talk about is psychological. One of the depressing things for me to walk into the halls of a World Bank or somewhere and find a fellow African who says, oh, we can't really return that art back home because we can't really manage it. Well, our ancestors who made that art, how did they manage it? So really, we are capable, and we can do this kind of thing. Yeah.
All right. So it's been a very interesting discussion, and I want to get to a final comment from you all, because we've looked at the sentiments coming out of this discussion regarding how Africa can progress its identity on the global stage. And in terms of measurables, though, what can the arts and the culture and the heritage actually do to promote Africa's socio-economic emergence on the global scale? I'll get your closing remarks as you wind that up, Ukona.
But first and foremost, for me, like one of the most important things to kind of not ever forget to say, if we're speaking to this in relation to the role of the African Union, then a very key thing is about how does the African Union create policies and that make whatever we've been dreaming about here possible, and how do they have the right kind of conversations at a UN level, at an AU level, and at our national government level to kind of achieve these grand aspirations. And I think one of the key things that need to happen is a more intentional effort to invite people who actually do work in the sector into the room, because some of these conversations, if this is not your life's work and you've not spent time being an expert at it, they can seem difficult. But the minute you invite people in the room who work in the space, there's so much value that can be added. So for me, at this stage, one of the most critical first steps is about making sure that the right people are in the room when these discussions, when these plans are being made, when these long-term goals are being made, because we are then able to give meaning and flesh based on what we know to exist in the field, and based on what we have come to learn through many years of working in the sector.
Patrick, your
Yes.
thoughts?
Yes, one of the things I was so looking forward to talking about, and which I think we alluded to, is the issue of languages, African languages. That's something the AU and even governments can do, just really providing a more supportive environment, maybe even having policy frameworks on how we can promote African languages. The principal person who actually have done that is a Kenyan author, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I got his book here called Wrestling with the Devil. You probably know about him very well. He's single-handedly done a lot of work. Now, imagine if people like the AU and African governments can be behind such work to promote African languages, because indeed that's one of our richest cultural heritage.
Farai, you have the final word on this.
Well, thank you very much. I think my colleagues there have articulated some of the more tangible things that we must do as an African continent. I am looking forward to President Kagame's report to the heads of state, him in charge of African institutions reform agenda, and having elected a panel of international African experts to help him to that end. It's paramount that there has to be a rethinking of what culture is. There has to be a rethinking of what creative industries are and how they can contribute to the creative economies of Africa. Creative industries are a $2 trillion business annually. $250 billion of exports in probably 2018, 2019. Africa's share of that is minuscule. And one of the things that the institutional reform has to do is to allow African countries to domesticate the Charter for African Cultural Renaissance. It's all there in that charter. And the Agenda 2063 articulates all these things. The gap is to find a commonality in African values where there's less corruption, where there's less conflict, where there are less wars, and more resources are put into sustainable development so that we can maximize the potential that's coming out of the creative sector. I think there are going to be a couple of game changers here. The young population, the so-called youth bulge in Africa, coupled with technology, is going to be an important factor in the renaissance that the African leaders are talking about. But they themselves will need to really tell the peoples of Africa that they have moved from an OAU, which was a union of African leaders, to the AU, which they say is a union of the African people. And African people in that game are represented by their cultures, the way they live. And now they want to maximize what they do and how they live and derive economic value out of it.
All right, we'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you very much for your insightful thoughts there. And that is it on Talk Africa this week. Thank you to our panelists for their insights. Farai Mfunya, Executive Director of the Culture Fund of Zimbabwe Trust, a non-profit organization connecting African communities in the arts to financial and technical resources. Ukonan Salim Landu in Cape Town, she's an independent arts manager, and Patrick Banda in Washington, D.C., author of The Creative Wealth of Nations, Can the Arts Advance Development? And thank you too for tuning in to this week's discussion. The conversation continues online through our social media handles on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And see you again next week for more Talk Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.